Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20, 1967, in the small logging town of Aberdeen, Washington. His early years were filled with drawings, music, and laughter. But behind that joy was a boy who never truly felt he belonged anywhere. When Kurt was only 9 years old, his parents divorced, and it changed him completely. He once said that moment destroyed him. His mother, Wendy, described him as a happy, loving kid before the divorce, but afterward, he became quiet and angry. The world he knew had fallen apart, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. He began spending time alone, listening to music and painting dark pictures that showed his inner pain. Aberdeen was a small, grey town with few opportunities and many broken homes. People there didn't understand sensitive kids like Kurt. They called him strange, laughed at his art, and bullied him at school. He began feeling invisible, like he was living in a world where no one cared to understand him. But out of that loneliness came his first spark of rebellion and creativity. He started learning to play the guitar, using music as a way to express what words couldn't. When he played, it felt like he finally had a voice again. Music became his escape, his way of making sense of everything that hurt. But even as a teenager, the pain never truly left. It simply began to transform into sound, the sound that would one day change the world. During his teenage years, Kurt found comfort in punk rock, a raw and loud style of music that spoke directly to outcasts like him. He loved bands like the Melvins and Black Flag because they didn't care about fitting in. They were wild, loud, and unapologetically honest. That kind of honesty was exactly what Kurt had been searching for. He started performing with friends and writing songs about his frustration, confusion, and loneliness. Even then, his lyrics weren't about fame or money. They were about truth. Around this time, he met Krist Novoselic, another local musician, and the two quickly bonded over their love of punk. They began playing together, forming what would later become Nirvana. Kurt had finally found people who understood him, and that feeling of belonging gave him new life. They practiced in dirty basements and played small shows where barely a handful of people showed up. But every time they played, the room exploded with energy. It was chaos, it was noise, but for Kurt, it was peace. His voice, soft, yet screaming with emotion, began to stand out. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that's what made people listen. By the late 1980s, Nirvana's sound had evolved into something fresh, a mix of punk aggression and melodic sadness. No one knew it yet, but this was the birth of grunge, a genre that would soon give a voice to an entire generation lost between anger and apathy. In 1991, Nirvana released Nevermind, the album that would change everything. The first single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, became an anthem overnight. MTV played it non-stop, and suddenly, the world couldn't get enough of Nirvana. Kurt Cobain, the quiet boy from Aberdeen, was now the biggest rock star on earth. But fame wasn't what he had ever wanted. While others celebrated, Kurt felt overwhelmed and uncomfortable with all the attention. He wanted his music to speak for itself, but the media turned him into a symbol, the voice of a generation. He never liked that title. To him, he was just a broken man writing about pain. The pressure of sudden fame, endless interviews, and constant touring started to drain him. He suffered from chronic stomach pain that doctors couldn't explain. And he began using drugs, mostly heroin, to ease the agony. Friends said he looked tired all the time, like the light in his eyes was fading. Behind the loud guitars and screaming crowds was a man silently falling apart. His relationship with Courtney Love, the singer of Hole, added more chaos. They loved each other deeply, but fought just as hard. When their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born in 1992, Kurt was overjoyed but also terrified. He didn't want to fail her the way he felt his own parents had failed him. Fame, drugs, pain, and fear, they were all mixing inside him, pulling him toward a breaking point. By 1993, Kurt was living a double life, one in front of the world and one inside his own mind. On stage, he was a rock god, screaming his soul out to thousands of fans. Off stage, he was quiet, withdrawn, and constantly in pain. He wanted to quit the band, to leave the spotlight behind, but he also knew that music was his only outlet. It was the only thing keeping him alive. He often talked about wanting peace, but he didn't know how to find it. His heroin addiction grew worse, and his body was beginning to give up. Friends, bandmates, and even Courtney tried to help, but nothing seemed to reach him anymore. In March 1994, he overdosed in Rome. At first, people thought it was just exhaustion, but later, Courtney revealed it was a suicide attempt. Afterward, Kurt went into rehab, but he didn't stay long. He escaped after only a few days and disappeared. Those who saw him said he looked lost, like someone who had already made up his mind. He avoided interviews, skipped shows, and locked himself away in his Seattle home. Everyone was worried, but no one could stop him. Fame had become a cage, and the more people adored him, the more trapped he felt inside it. In November 1993, just months before his death, Nirvana performed for MTV Unplugged in New York. But this wasn't a typical concert. Kurt designed the stage himself. Black candles, lilies, and dim lights. It looked more like a funeral than a rock show. Some people on the crew even asked, "Is this a wake?" He just smiled. That night, instead of playing Nirvana's biggest hits, Kurt chose softer songs, quiet, emotional, and haunting. When he sang All Apologies and Where Did You Sleep Last Night, it felt like he was confessing something only his heart could understand. His voice cracked with emotion, and when the final note ended, there was a long silence. The audience didn't even clap at first. They were too moved. It was as if everyone knew they had just witnessed something sacred. Later, many would say that performance was his goodbye letter to the world, even if no one realized it at the time. The sadness in his voice, the look in his eyes, it was all there. After the show, Kurt told friends he was proud of it, but deep down, he still felt empty. He had given everything he had to his music, and there was nothing left to give. On April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain took his own life at his home in Seattle. He was only 27 years old. His death shocked the world. Fans couldn't believe that the man who had changed music forever was gone. His body was found 3 days later by an electrician, and beside him was a shotgun and a handwritten note addressed to his childhood imaginary friend, But. In that note, Kurt wrote about his love for music, his pain, and his inability to fake happiness any longer. He said he felt guilty for not being able to enjoy the success that others dreamed of. His final words were haunting: "It's better to burn out than to fade away." The world mourned deeply. Outside his home, thousands of fans gathered, crying, singing, and lighting candles. They didn't just lose a musician, they lost someone who had made them feel understood. Conspiracy theories later arose about his death, but what mattered most was the truth behind his pain. Kurt wasn't just running from fame, he was running from himself. From the depression that fame had only made louder. Even though Kurt Cobain's life ended too soon, his music never faded. Songs like Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Heart-Shaped Box, and All Apologies still echo through generations. His lyrics spoke for those who felt misunderstood, lonely, or lost in the noise of the world. Nirvana didn't just create a new sound, they created a movement, a voice for every young person who felt out of place. Kurt once said he'd rather be hated for who he was than loved for who he wasn't, and that honesty is what made him timeless. He wasn't a perfect man, he was fragile, flawed, and human, but that's exactly why people still connect with him today. Artists from all over the world cite him as an inspiration, and his story continues to remind people about the importance of empathy and mental health. The tragedy of Kurt Cobain isn't just in how he died, but in how deeply he lived, how much emotion, truth, and beauty he poured into every note he played. He showed that pain can create art, that honesty can touch millions, and that sometimes the loudest scream comes from the quietest soul. Kurt Cobain's story is not just about sadness or death. It's about a man who turned his deepest wounds into art that will live forever. He was proof that even broken people can create something beautiful, something that gives others hope. His life reminds us that behind every smile, there might be pain, and that kindness and understanding can mean more than we realize. In the end, Kurt didn't just leave behind songs, he left behind lessons. He taught the world that being different isn't a weakness. that sensitivity isn't shameful, and that expressing your pain can be powerful. For fans, his voice still feels alive, like he's whispering through the static of time, reminding them that they are not alone. Even decades after his death, Kurt Cobain remains more than a rock legend. He is a symbol of truth, vulnerability, and the struggle to be real in a world that demands perfection. He burned brightly, maybe too brightly, but his light still guides those searching for meaning in their own darkness. Kurt Cobain didn't set out to become the voice of a generation. He simply wanted to make honest music, songs that told the truth about confusion, love, anger, and despair. But honesty has power, and that power spread faster than he ever imagined. When Nirvana released Nevermind, rock music shifted forever. The slick, overproduced sound of the late 80s suddenly felt fake compared to the raw emotion of Smells Like Teen Spirit. The song's energy, the scratchy guitar riffs, and Kurt's half-screamed voice sounded like a generation waking up. Teenagers who had felt invisible finally heard themselves in his lyrics. Lines like "Here we are now, entertain us" became an anthem for youth tired of being told how to think or feel. Kurt had tapped into something bigger than himself, a shared loneliness. He showed that music didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. Even though he was uncomfortable with fame, Kurt continued to write songs that pushed the limits of rock. On the album In Utero, he poured out his pain without filter. Songs like Heart-Shaped Box and Rape Me shocked listeners with their raw emotion, but that was the point. He wasn't trying to please anyone. He was telling the truth. Critics at first didn't know how to react, but over time, the world realized that Kurt was doing what few artists dared. He was showing his soul, ugly and beautiful, all at once. For him, music wasn't entertainment. It was survival. Every lyric was a confession, every performance a cry for understanding. And that honesty continues to inspire musicians today. As Nirvana's fame exploded, Kurt's mental health began to crumble under the pressure. He hated interviews, hated photographers following him, and hated being called a hero. He once said, "I'm too sensitive. I need to be slightly numb to survive." Fame brought him money and comfort, but it also brought lies, rumors, and fake smiles. He didn't know who to trust anymore. People treated him like a myth instead of a human being. Some journalists mocked his struggles with addiction, and others wrote cruel stories about his wife and daughter. All of it made him feel even more isolated. The more famous he became, the smaller his world felt. Kurt's bandmates noticed the change. Dave Grohl later said that touring with Nirvana was both amazing and heartbreaking, because he could see that Kurt was drifting away. Between shows, Kurt would often lock himself in his room, playing acoustic guitar quietly for hours. Sometimes, he'd cry. He loved his daughter deeply, but felt unworthy of her. He once said he feared she would hate him for his mistakes. That kind of guilt ate at him. The pressure to be both a father and a rock icon became unbearable. Every time he went on stage, he gave everything he had, and afterward, he had nothing left for himself. Fame, to Kurt, was a mask he never wanted to wear. He once told an interviewer that he felt like a clown performing for people who didn't really listen to what he was saying. That feeling of being misunderstood haunted him until the end. Kurt's relationship with Courtney Love was one of the most publicized and misunderstood parts of his life. They met in 1990, drawn to each other's energy and darkness. Both were musicians, both were rebellious, and both carried deep emotional scars. Their love was passionate and chaotic, filled with tenderness one moment and explosive fights the next. The media painted them as a rock and roll disaster, but behind the noise was a genuine connection. Courtney once said that Kurt was the most loving person she had ever met, even when he was broken. They shared a wild sense of humor and an understanding of pain that few could comprehend. When Francis Bean Cobain was born in 1992, Kurt was terrified but also deeply moved. Becoming a father gave him a reason to live, but it also brought more anxiety. He wanted to give her a peaceful life, something he never had, yet his addiction and depression made that almost impossible. He loved holding her and watching her sleep, but he feared that one day she would see the same sadness in herself. In many of his later interviews,